a good place now. You are listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, I'm asking you the question, do you feel understood or misunderstood by others? How are you narrating your life? We don't think about how we're narrating our life. We don't think about how we're telling other people about ourselves. We don't think about how we're defining us as a character in our life. We don't realize how we identify ourselves and how we label ourselves to the outside world. We don't realize it because it becomes so second nature. It's ingrained in our brain, and it started at a very young age. And we don't realize how other people interpret our labels, our thoughts, our limitations, us being defensive, us feeling guilty, us feeling lesser than, not enough, not good enough, all these different things. We don't realize or understand how it is interpreted. Therefore, we don't really understand how we're narrating our life, because you have to have a narrator. Remember, in every story, there's a narrator that makes for clarity, right? It's the narrator that says, now John walked into Allison's house, and they live on this little house up a brick road, and they met this way. We have the narrator that's explaining the backstory so you understand the message. Okay? So as you being the narrator of your own life story, how are you defining that to the outside world? Is it clear? Is it really unclear? Is it ambiguous? What is it? And that's what I want to talk about in today's show. Don't miss later on in the hour, Reggie Harvey. Reggie Harvey joins me to discuss his perspective on narrating your own life. Reggie just wrote the book, Anatomy of a Patient, and it's a really amazing book that's out there to help people that are dealing with near-death illnesses, dealing with waiting on transplants, family members of those who are waiting on a transplant, and the list goes on. You can check that out on Facebook as well, and also on my website, ashleyburgess.com, Ashley, BERGES.com, and you can click through to the radio show and find more information. So let's talk about this. How are we narrating our life? Okay, what are some of the things that we're doing to narrate our life? Well, one of the first things that we're doing is we're using identifying labels. We're using these identifying labels to identify who we are to the outside world, okay? Let's talk about some of those labels right now. Okay, some of you might have labels as single parent. Some of you might have labels as divorced. As you can tell, I could be listing quite a bit of labels out here. You know, we have all kinds of labels going back to, you know, our marriage situation, if we're not married, our sexual situation, our work situation, whatever that looks like, and labels that we have carried on with us since we were little kids. And some of those labels might be more of feeling guilty or feeling anxious or not feeling good enough or not feeling valued or feeling undervalued. And all these labels, okay, all these feelings go into a defining label of how we expose ourselves, and I'm not meaning in a weird way, but how we expose ourselves to the outside world, how we show ourselves, right? How do we show ourselves to the outside world, and how do they understand? And so when I begin to think about identity labels, I find that more often than not, these labels are defining, okay, they serve to better define. But I feel that when we live by these labels, we end up putting ourselves into a small box because we're not being who we are. Just because somebody's divorced or just because they're married or whatever that looks like, that is not who they are. That's a facet, that's a label, but it's not who they are. It's just one small dimension of something within their life. And I find that we have a tendency of only seeing one or two sides of an individual. How many people do you know that you've never been to their home? How many people do you know that you've never been to their home and you've never been to their office? How many people do you know that you've never been to their home, you've never been to their office, you don't know their kids, you don't know their spouse, you don't know their dog? How many people do you know that you don't know any of that, and all you do is you maybe meet them out for dinner or lunch, or you see them at work or whatever? You see how we only see normally one side of an individual? So if you're only seeing one side of an individual, how do you begin to understand them? And better, if you're thinking about yourself, if people are only seeing one side of you, how are you showing them? What are you showing them? What side are you showing them? And how are they getting to know you? Because it's got to be much more encompassing than just one area. And that's when I realized that most people are quite misunderstood when it comes into day-to-day life. Most people's thought processes, the reason why they do things, all that stuff is misunderstood because, unfortunately, they are only showing a portion of themselves because they only feel like they can show that, or that seems to be the only thing that's the right thing to do in the moment that's presented. And I feel that when somebody gets to know very different facets of the individual, they begin to understand them better. They begin to understand them better. And I find that we as a society, based on things that we see, we begin to label people a certain way. We have a tendency of labeling them based on something or other. We have a tendency of putting them in this box and labeling them, when in reality, all we're doing is shrinking the individual down to one aspect of their life. I find also that we can be very misunderstood when people don't understand our actions. They don't understand our reactions. They don't understand our actions, our reactions. They don't understand why we do certain things, and so we become an enigma. We become a very interesting enigma. You can be interesting or you can be disturbing. It just depends. And people find that very interesting or repelling. But the fact is that they don't understand why you tick, how you tick, and why you do what you do. And so, again, that goes back to that misunderstanding. Because I find that in order to be fully understood, you have to put a lot out there. You got to put a lot out there. You got to put a lot out there for the general public to take in if you want to be fully understood. And even then, it's not going to be enough for some people to understand. Even then, some people are not going to gravitate to you. Even then, some people are going to still think that you're an ass. So if you think about it, a lot of times we're holding back. We don't want to talk about things. We don't want to add to this. We don't want to do that. We don't want to put ourselves out there. But in reality, we're just an enigma. There's how many people in this planet, okay? And if you don't set yourself out apart to be who you are, to narrate your life, then you're not put apart. You're not narrating it. You're just following along, being another lemming. And I find that that's when you become misunderstood. I find that more often than not, too, we have a tendency of needing to explain ourselves. We feel as though I have to explain myself till I'm blue in the face for other people to understand me. If I just explain myself more, then they'll get me. And, sometimes you can explain yourself and very quickly and to the point, and people will understand you, and they'll appreciate you for doing that, and they'll understand you, and they'll actually really care, and they'll actually put it out there to explain themselves. But sometimes over-explaining yourself leads to the point of questioning. When you have to over-explain yourself to the nth degree of why you're doing something, we really need to step back and analyze, who are we trying to explain ourselves to, and is there really any connection between us and them ever finding common ground? Is there? Because I found that if we actually show ourselves in the proper light, and I'm talking about narrating in the proper light, not over-explaining, but just narrating, I feel that we really don't need an explanation in a lot of what we do, that it will be understood, but it has to be apparent. It has to be apparent to other people. And we have to be aware of how we are projecting ourselves. How are we projecting ourselves in the moment? How are we wording and putting together our essential narration of our life? Sometimes we can be defensive, or we feel like we're not good enough. We might feel like everybody else is out there doing something amazing and we're kind of just falling by the wayside. We begin to have this self-esteem, this self-worth issue that's really plagued us from the beginning of time, even when we were children, growing up. And that's really what started it, right? Is that we didn't have that interacting. We didn't have that connection. Perhaps we didn't get the attention or the love or the support from family or friends growing up. And so we began to have a real low self-esteem and a self-worth that made us question who we are to the core. And that same reality continues into our adult life. And that reality becomes part of the narration. We're not good enough. We're never going to get there. It's never going to work for us. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's better than us. And you start thinking that way and you start basing your reality on that way. And what happens? We act from that position and people begin to actually treat us that way because we're already treating ourselves that way. Stay tuned. I'll be talking about more why we feel misunderstood, why and how we can be more understood. And again, asking you the question, how are you narrating your life? Stay tuned because Live Your True Life Perspectives with me, your host, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
I'm learning to fly.
Turn it up and jump in the deep end on Perspectives. Now, here's Ashley.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, I'm asking you, do you feel understood or misunderstood by others? How are you narrating your life? You know, when I think about narrating my life and I think about coming from my truth and speaking my truth, one of the biggest things that I have a tendency of doing that's not speaking my truth is to label myself. And I think many of us have that tendency of labeling ourselves. We have that position of putting ourselves into a box or defining certain things that we do. You know, I also think very interesting wise when we look at our family and our upbringing and that dynamic. What was that dynamic like? Was it very healthy? Was it very unhealthy? Was it more toxic? And when we go through certain toxic cycles, we have a tendency of playing that out in our adult life. We can play that out with many people, not just our loved ones, but also friends or maybe somebody, our significant other. And so when we think about these things and we realize that a lot of times we create these labels, we can be misunderstood or we can be understood, but all these labels serve to either help us to narrate our life or help us to hold ourselves back. Joining me live in studio, Reggie Harvey. Reggie Harvey is the author of the latest book, Anatomy of a Patient. He's also the survivor of a near-death illness, and he's also a good friend. Reggie, great to have you in studio today.
Hey, Ashley, I'm very happy to be here. The topic that you're discussing today makes me think back to my relationship with my father. I, as a child of about 8 or 9 years old, my father used to make me get dressed up in my Sunday best and follow him to the store. And I thought he was the meanest man on the planet because people would come up to him and say, may I help you, sir? And he says that his response would be, that has yet to be determined. And he would say, then I want to speak to the person who makes decisions. Well, sir, it's my role to help you. I don't care. I want to talk to the person you're thinking about right now. And they'd say, well, why? I'm here to help you. It's because I don't want to repeat myself. And I'm going to make an offer to buy something in your store, and I want to know if I'm speaking with the person who can approve it. And if it's not, you're wasting my time. It's my money. I'll spend it someplace else. And if he didn't get cooperation and introduced to the person who was in charge, he would leave. And I would be so embarrassed. I thought he was just blunt and impolite. Fast forward to my dealing with my illness. I learned that I didn't have time to waste. I needed to communicate effectively with confidence to my medical team. I had to build those relationships with those people quickly so that there would be no hesitation between their decision-making and my receiving the proper care. It also made me reflect on the relationships with the older people I grew up around. My godmother, my great-grandmother, and those all seemed to be very powerful people. They were in their 80s, 90s, and 100. And they seemed to not be intimidated by anything or anybody. And they weren't angry. They just didn't apologize for who they were. Recently, I had an epiphany in listening to a documentary interview of a Nobel Prize winning author and teacher of English literature. And she explained something in her interview that even as a young woman, she's now 88, but as a young woman, when she decided she was going to be an author, and she went to college for that and got her master's and all of that, she said, I realized I wanted to write about subjects I knew. And so she developed characters. Most of her characters are female characters, but they're not famous people. They're everyday people. That was the life she wanted to explore. But she took the posture, and this is what really turned me. She said, I don't explain or apologize for those characters, because to do so diminishes those characters. And so she says, I don't present myself in a politically correct way. Not that I mean to antagonize, but I don't need to explain to you why I exist in this world. So when I communicate with you, I tell you exactly what I feel. And I remember in my during my career, many of my colleagues didn't understand that I was a direct speaker. I was literally telling you what I wanted you to know. There was no hidden agenda. I told you, as stated or wrote, exactly what I intended to write, using exactly the words I wanted to use. And people who encountered me for the first time spent a lot of time trying to read between the lines, and there was nothing to read between the lines. I never was good at doublespeak. I had to learn. I was in college before I realized that people say wild and crazy things to push your buttons as part of the social fabric. I didn't know that. I thought you were just lying, and I didn't understand. So I had to learn all that stuff. Now I laugh at that, but now I realize there's value to intentionally realizing, as this author mentioned, to introduce myself to the reader and apologize for my point of view diminishes me, and I have no reason to do that. So that's sort of the subliminal lesson that I picked up along the way from interacting with older people all my life. That's where that courage and seemingly boldness comes from. They have survived so many things that should have knocked them out. They no longer feel pressed to make the environment comfortable for people they encounter. Not that they mean to upset them, but they're just raw. And your reaction when you encounter someone like that exposes your own biases and your own insecurities. So that was a lesson that I took away from observing that documentary. And I think that this is something about being authentic that everybody needs to learn. And even when you're communicating with people, that someone that you're just building a relationship with, and you want to present the best of yourself, but really what you want to do is present exactly who you are, the richness of who you are becoming. You want them to get that right away. You want to know if they're going to struggle with that. If they are, then it's probably best to just let that go and move on. I don't know why I never realized that this was a choice you could make in how you communicate and how you present yourself when you walk in a room. I remember my mom used to always say, when you walk in a room, own it. You don't know who's going to be there. You don't know what their attitude is. But when you walk in that room, it's, I don't really give a damn. I'm here for business. I take care of my business and I leave. And usually people will respond immediately to get you what you need. Reflecting on what I'm just talking about, I even see her posture from a much different perspective, and I understand it. It cut through a lot of bull, and it wasn't that she was ever really an obnoxious person, and neither was my father. But their lives had been difficult. They had overcome a lot of obstacles. They weren't bitter about it, but they were in a position to claim their space. And that's how they did it, was in not only nonverbal communication, but in their verbal communication. Your original thesis that opened this conversation, we are the narrators of our life. And if we truly embrace who we are in the moment, and knowing that we're going to evolve, likely with other experiences yet to come, we never need to apologize for who we are in the moment. And when we're going to interact with people who are familiar with us, as well as people who are unfamiliar with us, we need to present our true self right off the bat. No stage makeup, no key lights, no backlighting. Just present our raw self. Get all the bull out of the way. If people are insecure being around us, that's their issue, and you move on. For more information about me, simply go to reggieharvey.net.
Great perspective. And I love what he's talking about, because it is interesting when you think about the concept of how we are portrayed in the way that we narrate ourselves, and also how when we do realize, I'm sure many of us realize, when the older we get, the less that we deal with of stuff that doesn't matter anymore. And I think that the time is of the essence concept, because we have only a certain amount of time. We don't know how much time, and we want to connect with people, but we really have to use that time wisely to connect with folks that really understand who we are. Realizing quickly and being able to connect with those people that we can add to their life and they can add to ours. Stay tuned. I'll be talking more about how you can be understood instead of misunderstood and live your true life perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
This is Jake Busey, and you're listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, I'm asking you, do you feel understood or misunderstood by other people in your life? How are you narrating your life? What are you doing to explain your life? And I'm not talking about over-explaining. Okay, you remember what a narrator's like. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but when you're listening to a story, or you're watching a play, for example, a play where there's a narrator off to the side and you see him standing on stage and he's got the microphone and it's probably a little dark, a little dim, and he says, now so-and-so's walking to the house and they're having the conversation about the argument that just took place over XYZ. And so we have this told to us what's happening. And so what I found is that we are actually narrating our own life by the things that we say and the things we do, the activities we do and the activities we don't do, the choices we make, the choices we don't make, the things that we love, the things we don't love. And so we are actually narrating our life for other people to understand, and they're either understanding or they're not understanding. They're either feeling connected or they're not feeling connected. And what happens is that a lot of times our own negative broken record, our own identity labels get in the way of our narration. I feel that everybody has these good qualities. I feel like everybody has something they do that's better than everybody else on the planet. But in order to see that, you actually have to have self-belief. You actually have to see yourself having that type of value and not misdirecting that, but actually spending time in that time, spending mindfulness to really explore those things. One of the things that I want you to think about right now is, how often do you feel guilty? How often do you feel guilty about things that really, quite honestly, you shouldn't feel guilty about? Okay. A lot of us were raised in family dynamics where there was a lot of guilt. There was a lot of shame. And so even if we're doing the right thing by us, we might feel bad. Maybe you cut someone out of your life that might be a negative might bring negativity in your life. Maybe you cut an energy sucker out of your life that's been challenging and really mess with you and really puts you down over a period of time. And you feel bad about doing that because you've known them for so long. Perhaps you feel defensive. What about being defensive? Because you feel like you've had to defend yourself your whole life, that when people ask you questions, instead of hearing it as a question, you hear it as a question of you, a question of your value, a question of your understanding, a question of who you are, a question of your wisdom. Many of us are coming from that guilt position or that defensive position. But I think a lot of us fall into the concept of coming from the not good enough position. Low self-worth, low self-value. And that low self-value is predicated by the low self-worth, right? They go together. It's like they're holding hands. And that's all began at usually a pretty young age. And other things that happen in our life can compound it. So maybe we recently went through a really brutal divorce. And we already had self-esteem issues, self-worth issues. And now we've gone through this divorce and it's painful. And it's dragging on, and this is just adding to our self-esteem, self-worth issues. Perhaps we just lost a job, or we just, whatever, something happened that really brought us to our emotional knees. And we don't know how to get out of it. We don't know how to get over it. And so there we are feeling we're not good enough. And so in every situation socially, when we present ourselves, we don't realize it, but we're actually presenting ourselves from the narration of not being good enough because we haven't worked on it. We feel like we can compartmentalize those issues. Well, I'm telling you, sister, I'm telling you, brother, right now, there is no compartmentalization of anything. It's all a ruse. When was the last time you got really angry at a situation, like a deep situation? Like maybe you got really angry at your spouse or your mom or your dad or something that really tumultuously happened. How much of that anger kind of spilled out and everything you did, like all the time, right? I know that we feel like we can compartmentalize, but most of the time that anger came out in just different spurts and here and there in different relationships. Maybe we lost our cool a couple of times, said some things we didn't really mean. Yeah. Compartmentalization, it's a myth. And so when we compartmentalize, we don't do it. But what happens is that when we think, okay, well, I'll hide the fact of the sadness that I feel about the divorce, or I'll hide about the fact that I feel about this or that, or losing my job, or whatever happened. Maybe you got cheated on and you keep feeling that, and you feel like that directly relates to how you're not good enough, and then that takes down your self-value, and then you question yourself, and so that's where that comes from, and you begin to question your own reality with that, feeling bad about how could your spouse do that, or how could your lover do that because it hurts your feelings. And again, you go into work situations, social situations, having that on the mind, and whatever you're saying is really coming from a filter of that. Okay? So you know how you have those Brita filters, like those water filters that you get in the refrigerator, and you stick it in the refrigerator, and you know how it filters stuff? So if you put inside that filter guilt or shame, not being good enough, being too defensive, all that kind of stuff, well, it's just going to filter out through it. It's not going to change anything. And so it's going to come out in your expression. It's going to come out in your word and deed. It's going to come out in your thoughts and feelings. It's going to come out in your interactions with other people. Right? And so when we're narrating our life, we have to be aware that this is probably happening in the background. We have to be aware that this is happening in the background. And that's what's so powerful, is we want to understand that we have to be aware of this. We have to be aware of when we're feeling guilty. We have to be aware of these situations that we put on ourselves. We have to be aware of when we feel bad. We have to be aware of our insecurities, because our insecurities directly reflect into the narration of our life, because we can't let go of those until we actually properly deal with them. Because otherwise, we're coloring our life by the things that we find the most problematic in our life, and we begin to label ourselves. And so we might be not doing it vocally, but when we come across somebody that we feel has a better life, or somebody that we feel is better than us, or somebody that we feel has more on the ball than us, or is more intelligent or more wise, we begin to feel lesser. We begin to define ourselves lesser. We begin to see them as having a hierarchy, or we begin to get angry with them. Do you see what I'm saying? And so until we actually realize our insecurities and understand where they originated at, and how you do that is to figure out, what are your insecurities? I mean, let's get real. What are you insecure about? What are the things that frighten you? What are the things that scare you? What are the things that you really need to deal with that you haven't dealt with? You know, most of the time in life, we sweep this under the rug because it seems too overwhelming. It seems like something we can't deal with. It seems like something that is going to be problematic. What we find we might not like. And that's a big deal. It's scary. What we find we might not like. We don't want to see that. That's not something we want to deal with. That's fearful. It's scary. And so we feel overwhelmed with actually seeking to find these insecurities. And so instead of really finding them, we just kind of bury them under the rug, and we don't get any clarity on our issues that we really need to work on. And so I'm asking you right now, what are some of the labels that you've given yourself? What are some of those labels? Okay? And are all those labels positive? If they aren't, why are you keeping them around? And if some of them aren't positive and some of them are quite negative, where did they come from? Where did they originate from? Where did they start? Did they start at a very young age? Did they start in adulthood? Did they start after something that massively happened in your life, a very emotional, traumatic time? Think about that. The relationship with you is the most important relationship you'll ever have with anyone. It's you. And we mostly have a tendency of getting to know other people very well, but, you know, honestly, if you are ignoring you, you're ignoring the most important person, because until you get yourself right, you don't move on. Until you understand yourself and get this right, still game on. This is the reason why we're here, is to have unconditional love and support for ourselves, and then we can use that same energy to radiate to the people in our lives to offer them love, unconditional love, and support. We might not always respect what somebody does, but we can unconditionally love them. Respect and love are two different things. Unconditional love and conditional love are two different things. Conditional love is based on what somebody does for me, what they give me, how they make me feel. Unconditional love has nothing to do with that. None of that has anything to do with it. It's based on the fact that you're another human, another spirit, and I love you at your core, even though I might not always agree with what you're doing. Stay tuned when I return. I'll be talking more about how you can be understood, because you have to understand yourself first to be understood by others. That is the key, and I'm going to help you figure out how to do that. Some simple steps you can do right now. If you haven't already, go online, Google YouTube. Go to YouTube and put in Ashley Burgess. Ashley, Berges. New video content up every week on my YouTube channel on relationships, marriage, understanding yourself, and the list goes on. Stay tuned, because Live Your True Life Perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
Get in here. You're listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, I'm talking about being understood. Do you feel like you're understood or misunderstood by the people in your life? And how are you narrating your life? How are you speaking about your life? How are you telling about your life? How are you connecting with others about your life? What is the conversation, the commentary, the labels, the feelings, and the list goes on? We don't realize that we really can't compartmentalize anything. The way we feel about ourselves directly reflects on how we talk about ourselves. Right? So how do we become more understood? How do we become more understood and have that honesty in our life and really be that proper narrator in our life? How do we become the proper narrator in our life to narrate our life in the proper way? Well, the first thing that you want to do is you want to dig into the insecurities that you have in your life. We all have insecurities. They're there. Some of us are masking them better. Some of us aren't. And there's no really good mask, right? I mean, the masking is just covering up the issue, right? We mask it from the outside world. We think nobody can see it, but yet it's like a deep-seated situation that we need to deal with. And the more we mask of it, the harder it is to work on. The harder it is to work on, the more we avoid it. You see how this goes. And so we have to really focus on this. We have to dig into the insecurities. We got to dig into them and feel what they feel like to really get a handle on stuff. Because the insecurities that we have come out in all the stuff we do. It does. It comes out in all we do. And it's being reinforced by how we feel. It's being reinforced by what we say and what we think. And so those insecurities become part of the narration. And then a lot of times with those insecurities, it's not understood very well. And so we become misunderstood. And one of the biggest things about the human being is that we all want to be understood. Nobody wants to be misunderstood. You know how it feels like to be misunderstood? Yeah, because you've been misunderstood. You know exactly how it feels. It's not fun. Nobody says, wow, that's great. You know, they had no idea what I was trying to say. Everything I said went under their feet or over their head, and they just have these funny looks, really, quite honestly. And I don't really think anybody really likes me. I'm not really sure, or people might be scared of me, or they might feel bad for me, or they might be depressed for me, or whatever, or they feel like they can't know me, or they feel like I have a shield up. Whatever it is, it's like taking us more and more away from being able to understand ourselves, be able to see ourselves, and be able to be aware and understand ourselves. Because remember, the narration is not good if you don't understand the reason for it. So if the narrator doesn't understand what the lead character is doing in the play, the narrator is not going to do a good job of explaining what the lead character is doing in the play. It's going to actually do a pretty bad job, and we're probably going to get pretty lost. We're probably not going to understand. We're probably going to be like, man, this play is not really good. You know what I mean? I can't believe I wasted this time. I need to get out of here. Think about it. Okay? So it's really quite profound, but it's also quite simple. So another thing that you want to do is you want to become aware of the negative broken record. Now, you can go and you can read blogs that I've written years and years ago. You can go and you can watch videos on YouTube that I've created. Just go to YouTube and put in Ashley, B-E-R-G-E-S, Ashley, B-E-R-G-E-S, and you're going to find the information that you need. You can just put in negative self-talk is probably the tag, negative self-talk with Ashley Burgess. And if you go to that negative self-talk, you're going to find a lot of videos that I've created that really talk about that negative self-talk, that negative broken record, understanding that, being able to see it, right, for what it is. Be able to recognize from where it came, and being able to be more mindful of it. Because once we're aware of that, it makes everything a lot easier. It just does. So as everything gets a lot easier and we're able to understand why we do what we do, things change. Life changes. Things get better because we have to be responsible with who we are. We have to understand, okay, this is why I do what I do. This is where this thought came from. This is why I feel this way. This is why I outwardly speak this way or have this hang up or issue because of X, Y, and Z. And if we know this, we can actually, narrate better. We can explain better. We can acknowledge better, and people will understand where we're coming from. Another thing that I want you to think about, and I know all these are big ideas, big thoughts, big stuff, things that have to be done, and I get it. But the next thing that you want to do is you want to become more mindful. When we're not being mindful, we get sucked in the trap of the emotion. We get sucked in the trap of the stress, the anxiety. We get sucked in the trap of thinking about what happened yesterday, what happened today, and all of that going on. And we don't focus on what's happening right now at this moment. We excommunicate ourselves from the situation. We become an outsider looking into our own life. And what happens is we manifest problems that way. So when we're not being mindful, what we're doing is we're taking ourselves out of the living You know, I've had clients who have wrecked their cars when they're too busy thinking about all the stress in their life, when they're too busy thinking about all the problems in their life, and they're not thinking about driving. They're not focusing on driving. They're not in the moment of driving. And so we have to do this. This is some big stuff. I know it's big level, big ticket items here, but this is the only way that when you talk about things that matter to you, people will understand. People will see the trajectory of how it connects, and people will see the tapestry of who you are. Otherwise, people don't know where you stand. They don't understand. You get misunderstood. You feel isolated. You feel insecure. You feel like people don't get you. You know, you see how the list goes on? All of it coming from a stress point of the fact that we feel misunderstood. And being misunderstood is not a powerful position to be in. Being misunderstood is a painful position to be in, and it makes us feel as though we want to hide more and excommunicate from the world. And these are some big things, and I have much more that I'd like to talk about, but just being aware of self is powerful. And so when you're thinking about this concept about being the narrator in your life and being understood, what are you doing to understand yourself? If we don't understand ourselves, we can't be our narrator. If we don't understand ourselves, we cannot communicate properly to get what we want or to understand why something's happening or not happening. In order to really be able to get what we want in life and to achieve what we want, we have to be able to vocalize and articulate and be honest and positive about what that is, to convey the message to other people and to convey who you are to the individual that you are having the conversation with. I hope this show has helped you. Please check out my website, ashleyburgess.com, Ashley, BERGES.com, and live your true life perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Burgess, will be back this time in 3 shakes.